Hello again. Welcome back to the study of the book, The Wisdom of the Ancients, Mining the Riches of Genesis 1 through 11. My name is Steve Langford. I'm the author of the book, and I'm your guide in this video series. In this video, we turn our attention to the fourth of those 5 ancient stories found in Genesis 1 through 11. In this video, we'll be dealing with that story known as the story of Noah and the flood, found in Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9. The third story, the story of Cain, actually sets up the story of Noah and the flood. You'll remember the story of Cain ended with Cain's genealogy, in which his great-great-great-grandson lived out of a spirit of unlimited, disproportionate retaliation. If anybody hurt him, he would kill them. Well, the inevitable result of such a spirit of unlimited retaliation is violence perpetuated. And we will see in just a moment that one of the reasons for the decision to destroy the earth was that it was full of violence. The very spirit that was expressed in Cain's descendant. Now, the story of the flood is tied to the story of the garden, Genesis 2 and 3, through the genealogy found in chapter 5, Seth's genealogy. And the editors seemingly draw a contrast between the genealogy of Cain, found in the last part of Genesis 4, and the genealogy of Seth, found in Genesis 5. I won't go into those comparisons in this video, but I do address it in the book. Particularly look at the 7th generation, which would have been Lamech in Cain's genealogy. So we get the story of the flood on the heels of the story of Cain, tied to the story of the garden through a genealogy. Now here's the thing. In the story of the garden, Genesis 2 and 3, we deal with our relationship with God, how we live in relationship with God. And the story teaches us that we naturally live out of a spirit of self-reliance in which we disobey. We do not live in faithful obedience to the ways of God. In the story of Cain in chapter 4, we deal with the issue of how we live in relationship with one another, and how those relationships are so often filled with conflict, with violence, in which we see one another as other, as a threat, and so we hold each other at arm's length, or we use our power to eliminate the threat. Relationship with God, relationship with one another. In the story of the flood, we see how God deals with us in that state of brokenness, in our sense of sin, as we live with the consequences of the choices that we make. Did you know that the story of the flood is one of the oldest stories found written down in human history? Did you know that there are many versions of the flood? There are many nations that have a flood story. And the story that we have in Genesis 6 through 9 is the Hebrew people's adaptation of one of these older stories, because there are stories much older than the one that we have in our scriptures. What the Hebrew people did was to take one of those older versions and tell it through the lens of Genesis 1, because the language we find in Genesis 1, the creation story, we find throughout the flood story, because the story of the flood is a reversal of that creation. In fact, the story that we have in our Bible is actually 2 versions. There are 2 versions that have been woven together, that have been shuffled together. There were two versions among the Hebrew people. And because these two versions have been shuffled together, we are given two different reasons why God decided to destroy the earth. We're given conflicting information about the animals that Noah took on the ark. One version says he took a pair of every living creature. The other version says he took 7 pairs of those animals that were considered to be clean, but only 1 pair of those that were considered to be unclean. And then the third place that we see this dual version woven together is at the end of the story, where God makes a covenant never to again to destroy the earth. So we have two versions woven together. So let's look at this story. It begins with God's decision to destroy the earth. And again, there are two versions, and so two different reasons are given. The first reason is found in chapter 6, verse 5, where it says, "The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually." So what the Lord saw when he looked at the earth was wickedness. And that wickedness was there because every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was evil continually. Remember that phrase. We're going to get it again. We're going to come across it again at the end of the story. But the issue was evil inclination in their hearts. God saw the wickedness that grew out of the evil inclinations. And this reference to the evil inclinations reminds us of Cain. How Cain plotted, schemed, lured his brother into the field where he could destroy him. God had created humankind with the same kind of creative capacity and creative imagination that is found in the divine self. And yet humans had taken that imagination and that creativity and used it to destroy rather than to create. To use it in a way that created more chaos rather than resolving chaos, as we saw in the Genesis 1 story. The second version gives us a different reason for God's decision. It's found in chapter 6, verse 11. "Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight." And notice this version speaks of God. The first version said the Lord. "Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence." God saw that the earth was corrupt. And the reason that the earth was corrupt was that it was filled with violence. Again, drawing our attention back to the Cain story, how Cain used his power violently to kill his brother, but also his great-great-great-grandson, living out of that spirit of unlimited retaliation, which creates a world filled with chaos, a world filled with violence. So when you put these two different reasons together, you'll see that wickedness and violence are the same. Wickedness is expressed in violence, using our power to destroy. The result of this wickedness and this violence is that it corrupts the earth. It fills the earth with chaos. And the source of the wickedness and violence is the human heart. That within us, created in the likeness of God, that takes that creative imagination and creative power, but uses it against others. In the story of the flood, what we experience is the reversal of creation. The earth is returned to the chaos that it knew before God started working with the earth when waters covered the face of the deep, Genesis 1, chapter 2. So it is a return to chaos. And the way that this reversal of creation takes place is to reverse the creative acts of God. On the second day of creation, in Genesis chapter 1, God took the waters that covered the face of the earth and separated them so that there were waters above and waters below, the sky and the seas. But what we find in the story of creation is that those two waters reconverge. Rather than being separated, they unite again. You find it in chapter 7, verse 11. On that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth. That's the fountains of the earth. That's the fountains in the seas. And the windows of the heavens were open. That is, the waters above, the skies, and the waters of the ocean, the deep, reconverged so that they overwhelmed the earth. And the objective of that overwhelming the earth was to destroy every living creature, or as the language of Genesis 1 says, everything that had the breath of life in it, from Genesis chapter 2. So the flood accomplished what it set out to do, what God set out to do. The text tells us that in chapter 7. So God blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, human beings and animals and creeping things and birds of the air. They were blotted out from the earth. That was the objective of the flood. And yet the flood that destroyed all of life saved Noah and those with him on the ark. Only Noah was left and those that were with him in the ark. For one, the flood brought devastation. For another, the flood brought salvation as they rode on the face of the waters through the ark. The story of the flood comes to a close in Genesis chapter 8, when verse 1 says, "But God remembered Noah." God didn't forget. God remembered Noah. And God sent a wind to blow across the face of the waters. Just as in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, darkness covered the waters that covered the earth, and the wind from God, the Spirit of God, brooded across those deep waters. Now we have God sending the same wind, the same Spirit across the waters of the flood to drive back the waters, to return the earth so that dry land could emerge once again the way it did on the third day of creation. The climax to the story is not the flood. The climax to the story, the point found in the story, is in what God did after the flood. Again, there are two versions. In the first version, found in chapter 8, Noah is off of the ark, builds an altar, offers a sacrifice. In chapter 8, verse 21, "And when the Lord smelled the pleasing odor, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind." What God did after the flood was to say, I'm not going to do that again. I'll never again destroy. But remember that God chose to destroy the earth with a flood because of a specific reason. Now listen to why God chooses not to destroy the earth again. "I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth." Did you catch it? The earth was wicked, filled with violence. But the source of that wickedness and violence was the evil inclination of the human heart. The source was the human heart. And after the flood was over, the human heart was unchanged. The source of the problem was not solved, was not addressed. It's as though God is saying, well, that didn't work. I won't do that again. It's as though the Hebrew editors took this ancient story and used it to portray God as learning something. How do you deal with the chaos that our disobedience to God, that our fear of one another and using our power against one another, how do you resolve that chaos? God said, I'll try judgment. But it didn't solve the problem because it didn't address the source of the problem. The human heart remained unchanged. It was Jeremiah, the prophet, who later said, the days are coming when I'll make a new covenant and I'll write my laws on their hearts. In other words, God's going to do something about the heart. Jesus in Mark chapter 7 said, it is out of the heart that all of the problems flow, and thus it is the heart that must be changed. Judgment doesn't solve the problem of human evil. Judgment doesn't solve the problem of human wrongdoing. If we're going to solve the problem, something must change the human heart. The second version of what God chose to do after the flood is found in chapter 9. And there is where God makes a covenant with Noah, with those who were on the ark with him, and with all of creation. And that covenant is, I will never again destroy the world. I will never again destroy every living thing with waters. And as a sign of that covenant, God, you know the story, God put a bow in the sky, that's what we call the rainbow. But did you know who the rainbow was for? God said, so that when I see the bow, I will remember. The rainbow is to remind God that judgment doesn't solve the problem of what's in the human heart. Which raises the question, so how do you solve the problem? How do you change what's in the human heart? And that's what we see in this second expression, version of what God did after the flood. God chose to live in relationship, in covenant. And out of this covenant with Noah will come in Genesis chapter 12 a covenant with Abram. And through Abram and his descendants with the people of Israel, and through the people of Israel with all of the peoples of the earth. God will live in relationship with them. And in that relationship, God will change what's in the human heart. God will reorient the heart away from evil inclinations, back towards God, and back towards one another. As God made this covenant with Noah and his sons, he said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The exact same command that was given to the man and the woman created in the Genesis 1 creation story account. The means by which God would repopulate the world was through Noah's three sons and their families. And Genesis chapter 10 talks about all of the people groups that came out of those three sons and their families. It's a genealogical table that talks about how the earth was populated with different groups of peoples who all spoke the same language because they came from the same family source. And that sets up the fifth and final story in Genesis 1 through 11. The story in chapter 11 of the Tower of Babel. That'll be the focus of our next video. But let's not rush to it. There's so much to mine out of this great flood story. We have to move beyond our familiarity with it so that we can see what it actually says. Do reflecting and sharing together. What did you learn about the story of the flood that you didn't know? Maybe you want to talk about the violence that is such a part of our world, our society, yeah, even our lives. Maybe you want to talk about, reflect on the human heart as the source of that violence and wickedness that corrupts the earth. Perhaps you want to deal with this whole concept that God is portrayed as learning that judgment doesn't solve the problem. Perhaps you want to explore the concept of living in relationship with us as the way that God solves and changes the human heart. There's a lot to explore. There's a lot to mine. Dig deep, lest you miss the riches of this all too familiar story. Then we'll gather again, and we'll look at the final story, the story of the Tower of Babel. As always, I would enjoy hearing from you. You can communicate with me at Pastor Steve Langford, DMIN@gmail.com. I'll look forward to hearing from you, and I'll enjoy the conversation we share. And until then, I pray for you. The peace of Christ be with you.